The desert heat shimmered off the rocky terrain as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos checked her instruments one final time. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, sat ready on the tarmac at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. The morning briefing had been routine close air support mission for ground troops operating in the Kunar province. What Maria didn't know was that she was about to participate in one of the most intense rescue missions of her career. Maria had joined the Air Force 8 years ago, driven by a childhood dream of flying fighter jets. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had spent countless hours watching planes overhead, imagining herself in the cockpit. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had initially been skeptical about his daughter's military aspirations. "Flying's dangerous business, Mija," he would say, but Maria's determination never wavered. After graduating from the Air Force Academy, Maria had fought hard to earn her spot as an A-10 pilot. The Warthog wasn't the most glamorous aircraft in the Air Force fleet, but Maria loved everything about it. Built around its massive 30 GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the A-10 was designed for one purpose: providing close air support to ground troops. It could take tremendous damage and still fly home. Maria appreciated that kind of toughness. On this particular morning, in October 2014, Maria was part of a two-ship formation tasked with supporting operations in the mountainous border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban activity in the area, and several forward operating bases had requested additional air cover for their patrols. As Maria taxied toward the runway, she thought about the phone call she'd received from home the night before. Her younger brother Carlos had been accepted to medical school. Their mother had been crying with joy on the phone. "Two of my children serving their country," she had said proudly. Maria carried that pride with her into every mission. The takeoff was smooth, and Maria quickly formed up with her wingman, Captain Jake Morrison. Jake was a veteran pilot with over 200 combat missions under his belt. He had taken Maria under his wing when she first arrived in theater, teaching her the subtle art of close air support that couldn't be learned in training. "Viper 2-1, this is Viper 2-2, Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "Weather looks good today, should be a milk run." Maria keyed her mic. "Roger that, 2-2, let's hope it stays quiet." Their first waypoint was a small valley where Army Rangers had been conducting reconnaissance for the past 3 days. The Rangers reported all quiet, and Maria and Jake orbited overhead for 2 hours before being released to return to base. It was shaping up to be one of those routine missions that pilots both appreciated and found slightly boring. But as they turned toward home, the radio erupted with urgent chatter. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, this is Neptune 6. We are under heavy fire and need immediate close air support." Maria felt her pulse quicken. Neptune was the call sign for a Navy SEAL team operating in the region. SEAL teams didn't call for help unless things were really bad. "Neptune 6, this is Viper 2-1 flight," Jake responded immediately. "We're 10 minutes out from your location. What's your situation?" The SEAL team leader's voice was calm but urgent. "Viper 2-1, we have a squad-sized element pinned down in grid reference 42S MD 12345 67890. Heavy small arms fire and RPGs from multiple positions. We've got wounded and need extraction." Maria pulled up the coordinates on her navigation system. The location was in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges, perfect terrain for an ambush. She could already see the tactical challenges they would face providing close air support in such confined terrain. 2-1, this is 2-2, Jake called over the radio. "I'm lead on this one, stay high and watch for threats from the ridgelines." "Copy 2-2, I've got your 6. As they approached the target area, Maria could see smoke rising from the valley floor. The SEAL team had popped colored smoke to mark their position, but the enemy was well concealed among the rocks and caves that dotted the hillsides. "Neptune 6, Viper 2-1 flight on station. We see your purple smoke. Confirm you are the element marked by purple smoke." "Affirmative, Viper. Purple smoke marks our position. Enemy positions are on the ridgelines to our north and east. We need danger close support, they're less than 100 meters from our position." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Danger close missions were among the most challenging and dangerous types of close air support. One mistake, one slight miscalculation, and friendly forces could be killed by their own air support. Jake's A-10 rolled in for the first attack run. Maria watched as tracer rounds erupted from multiple positions along the ridgeline, reaching up toward Jake's aircraft like deadly fingers. The Taliban fighters had prepared this ambush well, with overlapping fields of fire that made escape difficult for the trapped SEALs. "Good hits on the northern ridge," Jake called as he pulled off target. "But there are more shooters on the eastern slope. 2-1, can you work the eastern positions?" "Roger, working east," Maria replied, rolling her aircraft into a steep dive toward the enemy positions. As she lined up for her attack run, Maria could see muzzle flashes winking from caves and rock formations along the hillside. The terrain was incredibly complex, with the friendly forces directly below the enemy positions. She would need to use precision munitions to avoid hitting the seals. Maria selected a small diameter bomb from her weapons inventory and locked onto a cave mouth where she had observed heavy muzzle flashes. The laser-guided munition would give her the precision she needed for this close-quarters engagement. Neptune 6 Viper 2-1 in hot from the south, danger close on eastern ridge. Cleared hot Viper, we're taking heavy casualties down here. Maria pickled her weapon and immediately began evasive maneuvers as tracers filled the air around her aircraft. The explosion echoed through the valley, temporarily silencing the guns from that position. But almost immediately, new muzzle flashes appeared from other locations. Direct hit on target, Maria reported, but they've got more positions than we initially assessed. The battle was just beginning, and Maria realized that this was going to be far more complex than a simple close air support mission. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well, and the trapped SEAL team was in serious danger. Down in the valley, Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer Michael Reaper Richardson pressed himself against a large boulder as bullets whined overhead. His 8-man team had been conducting a reconnaissance mission when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. The Taliban fighters had waited until the SEALs were deep in the valley before opening fire from multiple positions. Richardson had been a SEAL for 12 years, participating in operations across Iraq and Afghanistan. He had earned his nickname Reaper for his deadly accuracy with a sniper rifle, but today his team was outnumbered and outgunned. 3 of his men were wounded, including his communications specialist who had taken shrapnel from an RPG explosion. "Chief, we've got movement on the northern slope," called out Petty Officer First Class Tony Spider Martinez, the team's point man. Spider had an uncanny ability to spot enemy movement even in the most challenging terrain. Richardson peered around the boulder and saw at least a dozen fighters moving down the hillside toward their position. The Taliban was trying to close the distance, probably planning to overrun the SEAL position before air support could be effective. "Everyone check your ammo," Richardson ordered. "We're going to have to hold this position until the birds can clear us a path out of here." Petty Officer Second Class David Kim, the team medic, was working on Hospital Corpsman Second Class Jackson, who had taken a bullet in the leg. "Chief, Jackson needs immediate medevac," Kim reported. "I've stopped the bleeding, but he's lost a lot of blood." Richardson keyed his radio. "Viper 2-1, Neptune 6, we need you to focus on the northern approaches. Enemy fighters are moving to overrun our position." "Roger, Neptune, we see the movement. 2-2 is rolling in now." Richardson watched as Jake's A-10 dove toward the northern ridge, its 30mm cannon erupting in a distinctive buzz-saw sound that every ground soldier learned to love. The high-explosive rounds tore into the rocky terrain, sending Taliban fighters diving for cover. But even as the A-10s worked over the enemy positions, Richardson could see that this was going to be a long fight. The Taliban had prepared this ambush site with multiple escape routes and fighting positions. Every time the aircraft hit one position, fighters would pop up from another location. "Spider, I need you to get on that rock outcrop and give me eyes on the eastern slope," Richardson ordered. "Rocky, you and Bear set up a base of fire toward the northern approach. We're going to make them pay for every meter they try to advance." Petty Officer First Class Robert Rocky Thompson and Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Bear Williams moved to positions where they could cover the most likely enemy approach routes. Both men were armed with M249 squad automatic weapons, giving the team some desperately needed firepower. The sound of the A-10s overhead was reassuring, but Richardson knew that air support couldn't do everything. His team would need to hold their ground and fight their way out of this valley. The question was whether they could last long enough for the aircraft to clear a safe escape route. As Maria pulled off her second attack run, she could see that the situation on the ground was becoming increasingly desperate. The SEAL team was completely surrounded, and enemy fighters were moving closer to their position with each passing minute. 2-2, we need to expand our search pattern," Maria called to Jake. "I'm seeing more heat signatures on the thermal scope. This ambush is bigger than we thought." "Roger that, 2-1, I count at least 40 enemy fighters in multiple positions. This is going to take everything we've got." Maria switched her radio to the frequency used by the Joint Terminal Attack Controller JTAC supporting the operation. "Hammer 77, this is Viper 2-1. We need immediate reinforcement for Neptune 6. Enemy strength is significantly higher than initial reports." "Viper 2-1, Hammer 77, came the reply from the JTAC. Additional assets are en route, but you're the closest support for the next 20 minutes. Can you maintain station? Affirmative. Hammer will stay until relieved or Winchester. Winchester was pilot slang for being out of ammunition. Maria checked her weapon's status and calculated how long she could maintain effective fire support. With careful ammunition management, she might be able to keep fighting for another hour. But an hour might not be enough. The SEAL team was taking increasingly heavy fire, and Maria could see enemy fighters getting closer to their position. If the Taliban managed to close the distance, the SEALs would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of maintaining safe standoff distances, she would bring her A-10 down into the valley and use the aircraft's cannon to create a protective barrier around the SEAL team. 2-2, I'm going to work low level in the valley. The terrain will provide some protection from the heavy weapons on the ridges. Negative 2-1, Jake replied immediately. That valley is a shooting gallery. You'll be taking fire from 3 sides. The SEALs are about to be overrun, Jake. Sometimes you have to take the risk. Before Jake could respond, Maria rolled her A-10 into a steep dive that would take her down into the valley at an altitude that would have made her flight instructors cringe. She was about to test both her skills and her aircraft's legendary toughness in ways that no training exercise could replicate. The radio crackled with urgent voices as multiple units tried to coordinate the increasingly complex rescue operation. But for Maria, everything had narrowed down to a simple mission: protect the men on the ground at any cost. As her A-10 leveled off barely 100 feet above the valley floor, Maria could see the SEAL team's position clearly for the first time. The 8 men were clustered behind a collection of boulders, with enemy fighters closing in from multiple directions. It was time to even the odds. The distinctive roar of the A-10's twin turbofan engines echoed off the valley walls as Maria Santos brought her aircraft down to treetop level. Flying this low in mountainous terrain required absolute precision, but it also gave her the element of surprise that might save the surrounded SEAL team below. Neptune 6 Viper 2-1 coming in low from your south, Maria called over the radio. Keep your heads down. Chief Richardson's voice crackled back. Roger, Viper, we see you coming in hot. Enemy fighters are advancing on our position from the north and east. Maria could see the tactical situation unfolding below her. Taliban fighters were using the rocky terrain to move closer to the SEAL position, darting between boulders and using natural depressions in the ground for concealment. The enemy had clearly planned this ambush carefully, choosing terrain that would make air support difficult while giving them multiple covered approach routes. She lined up her first strafing run on a group of fighters who were advancing down a dried riverbed toward the SEAL position. The 30mm GAU-8 cannon mounted in the nose of her A-10 was one of the most fearsome weapons in the Air Force arsenal. Originally designed to destroy Soviet tanks, it could tear through practically any target on the battlefield. Gun run from the south, Maria announced as she pressed the trigger. The cannon erupted with its distinctive buzz-saw sound, firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The high-explosive rounds chewed up the rocky terrain where the Taliban fighters had been advancing, sending debris flying in all directions. Several enemy fighters were caught in the open and eliminated immediately. But as Maria pulled up from her attack run, tracer rounds erupted from multiple positions along the ridgelines. The Taliban had positioned heavy machine guns and RPGs on the high ground, turning the valley into a deadly crossfire zone. Green tracers reached up toward her aircraft like deadly fingers. Taking heavy fire, Maria reported as she jinked her aircraft left and right to avoid the incoming rounds. But I got good hits on the northern approach. Jake's voice came over the radio. 2-1, you're drawing fire from every position in that valley. Get some altitude and let me work the high ground. Negative 2-2, the SEALs need immediate support. I'm making another run. Maria banked her A-10 around for a second strafing run, this time targeting enemy positions on the eastern ridgeline. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush site well. The steep terrain made it difficult for aircraft to attack without exposing themselves to defensive fire from multiple directions. As she rolled in for her second attack, Maria could see muzzle flashes erupting from caves and rock formations all along the eastern slope. The enemy had clearly prepared these positions in advance, with natural cover and overlapping fields of fire that made them extremely difficult to eliminate. She selected a cluster of fighters who were firing down at the SEAL position from a rocky outcrop. The 30mm cannon rounds impacted with devastating effect, silencing those weapons temporarily. But almost immediately, new muzzle flashes appeared from other positions. This is like playing whack-a-mole, Maria muttered to herself as she pulled off target. Down in the valley, Chief Richardson watched the A-10's attack runs with professional appreciation. The female pilot was taking enormous risks, bringing her aircraft down into the valley where it was vulnerable to enemy fire from three sides. But her aggressive tactics were exactly what his team needed. "Chief, the air support is keeping them honest," Spider reported from his observation position. "But we've still got fighters moving in from the west. They're trying to flank us." Richardson could see the enemy movement that Spider had spotted. A group of Taliban fighters was using a series of interconnected gullies to move around to the team's blind side. If they succeeded in flanking the SEAL position, the team would be completely surrounded with no escape routes. "Rocky Bear, shift your fire to the western approach," Richardson ordered. "Don't let them get around behind us." The two machine gunners adjusted their positions and opened fire on the flanking force. The 5.56 rounds from their squad automatic weapons forced the Taliban fighters to take cover, but Richardson knew it was only a temporary solution. His team was running low on ammunition, and the enemy seemed to have an unlimited supply of fighters. Petty Officer Kim, the team medic, crawled over to Richardson's position. "Chief, Jackson's condition is deteriorating. He needs immediate medevac, and Williams took shrapnel in the shoulder from that last RPG impact." Richardson looked at his wounded teammates. Jackson was pale from blood loss despite Kim's expert medical care, and Williams was still firing his weapon despite the obvious pain from his shoulder wound. These men had trained together for years, and Richardson felt the weight of responsibility for their lives. "Viper 2-1 Neptune 6, Richardson called over the radio. "We have urgent wounded and need extraction. Can you clear us a path to the southern end of the valley?" Maria's voice came back immediately. "Working on it, Neptune. I see a large enemy concentration at the southern exit. Give me 2 minutes." Richardson watched as the A-10 climbed to gain altitude for another attack run. The aircraft was showing visible damage from the intense ground fire. He could see holes in the wings and what looked like hydraulic fluid streaming from the right engine. "That pilot's aircraft is taking a beating," Spider observed. "She's still coming back for more." "SEALs aren't the only ones who don't quit," Richardson replied with admiration. Maria rolled in for her third attack run, targeting the enemy positions at the southern end of the valley. This was the most dangerous run yet, as she would be flying directly into the teeth of the enemy's defensive positions. But if she could clear this choke point, the SEAL team might have a chance to fight their way out of the valley. As she dove toward the target, every enemy weapon in the area seemed to open fire on her aircraft. Tracers filled the air like a deadly light show, and Maria could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her cockpit. An RPG exploded off her left wingtip, close enough to rock the aircraft violently. "Multiple hits," Maria called as warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. "But I'm still flying." The 30mm cannon thundered again as Maria strafed the enemy positions blocking the southern exit. She could see Taliban fighters diving for cover as the high-explosive rounds tore through their positions. Several weapons went silent, at least temporarily. But as Maria pulled up from her attack run, she felt the aircraft shudder and heard the distinctive sound of metal being torn apart. One of the engines was losing power, and hydraulic fluid was streaming from multiple locations on the aircraft. 2-1, you're trailing smoke," Jake called urgently. "You need to get some altitude and assess your damage." "Negative 2-2, the SEALs are making their break. I need to cover them." Richardson had seen the effect of Maria's last attack run and decided it was time to move. "Neptune 6 is moving," he announced over the radio. "We're fighting our way to the southern exit." The 8 SEALs moved in a disciplined tactical formation, with the wounded in the center and the able-bodied men providing covering fire. Rocky and Bear laid down suppressing fire while the rest of the team moved, then the forward elements covered while the machine gunners displaced forward. It was a textbook fighting withdrawal, executed by men who had trained together for years and trusted each other with their lives. But even with air support, they were still outnumbered and fighting through difficult terrain against an enemy that knew the ground intimately. Maria watched the SEAL team's movement from above and coordinated her attacks to support their advance. Every time enemy fighters tried to interfere with the team's movement, she brought her damaged A-10 around for another strafing run. "Viper 2-1, you've got heavy damage to your aircraft," Jake called over the radio. "Your left engine is barely running and you're losing hydraulic pressure. You need to break contact and head for base." "Not yet," Maria replied through gritted teeth. "The SEALs are still in the kill zone." The truth was that Maria's aircraft was in serious trouble. Multiple warning lights were flashing on her instrument panel, and she could feel the flight controls becoming increasingly sluggish as hydraulic pressure dropped. The A-10 was famous for its ability to absorb damage and still fly, but every aircraft had its limits. But Maria also knew that if she left now, the SEAL team might not make it out of the valley alive. The enemy was regrouping and bringing up reinforcements, and the SEALs were still several hundred meters from safety. Neptune 6 Viper 2-1, Maria called. What's your status? We're 50 meters from the southern exit, Richardson replied between bursts of gunfire. But there's another enemy position we can't see from down here. We're taking fire from the right flank. Maria scanned the terrain with her targeting pod and quickly located the hidden enemy position. It was tucked into a fold in the terrain that made it invisible from the valley floor, but gave the Taliban fighters a perfect angle to engage the retreating SEALs. I see them, Maria said. Stay low for 10 seconds. She rolled her damaged A-10 into what would be her most dangerous attack run yet. The hidden enemy position was in extremely rough terrain, requiring her to fly between two rock spires that left virtually no margin for error. With her damaged flight controls, the maneuver was bordering on suicide. Jake's voice was urgent over the radio. 2-1, don't attempt that run. The terrain is too tight for a damaged aircraft. But Maria was already committed to the attack. She threaded her A-10 between the rock spires with mere feet to spare on either side, then opened fire on the hidden enemy position. The 30 cannon rounds impacted with devastating effect, eliminating the threat to the SEAL team's flank. As she pulled up from the attack, Maria felt the aircraft shudder violently. The left engine finally gave up completely, flames trailing from the nacelle. Multiple hydraulic systems failed simultaneously, and the flight controls became extremely heavy and unresponsive. Mayday, Mayday, Maria called. Viper 2-1 has lost left engine and multiple hydraulic systems. Aircraft is barely controllable. 2-1, can you make it back to base? Jake asked with concern evident in his voice. Maria fought with the controls, trying to determine if her aircraft could stay airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. The A-10 was flying, but just barely. She was losing altitude steadily, and the remaining engine was running rough. But even as she struggled with her damaged aircraft, Maria could see that the SEAL team had successfully fought their way out of the kill zone. They were now in relatively open terrain where they could call for helicopter extraction. Neptune 6 Viper 2-1, Maria called through the static of her damaged radio. You're clear of the immediate threat area. Extraction birds should be able to reach you now. Roger, Viper, came Richardson's reply. Thanks for the cover. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. As Maria struggled to keep her aircraft flying, she reflected on the mission. The SEAL team was safe, at least for now. But her own situation was becoming increasingly desperate as warning lights continued to illuminate across her instrument panel. The real test was just beginning. The A-10 Thunderbolt II shuddered and bucked as Maria Santos fought to maintain control of her severely damaged aircraft. Smoke poured from the left engine nacelle, and the acrid smell of burning hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel like a deadly Christmas display, each one representing another critical system failure. Viper 2-1, this is 2-2, Jake's voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled urgency. I've got a visual on your aircraft. You're trailing heavy black smoke and losing altitude. You need to eject immediately. Maria's jaw clenched with determination as she wrestled with the unresponsive flight controls. The backup manual reversion system was all that stood between her and a complete loss of control, but even that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage as hydraulic pressure continued to drop. Negative 2-2, Maria replied through gritted teeth. I still have some control, going to try to make it back to friendly territory. The truth was that Maria's aircraft was dying around her. The left engine was completely destroyed, flames licking back from the nacelle despite the automatic fire suppression systems. The right engine was running rough and losing power, while multiple hydraulic systems had failed completely. Any reasonable pilot would have ejected already. But Maria wasn't thinking like a reasonable pilot. She was thinking like a combat aviator who had just saved 8 American lives and wasn't about to give the enemy the propaganda victory of capturing a downed American pilot. More importantly, she was flying over hostile territory where an ejection would likely mean capture, torture, and possibly execution. 2-1, your aircraft is not going to make it back to base, Jake insisted. The nearest friendly forces are 15 miles south of your current position. If you eject now, we can call in a combat search and rescue mission. Maria looked at her navigation display and calculated the distances involved. Jake was right, her aircraft would never make it back to Bagram Air Base. But 15 miles to friendly forces was still a long way when flying a crippled aircraft that was losing altitude at an alarming rate. She keyed her radio to contact the Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft coordinating air operations in the region. Magic 77, this is Viper 21. I have a disabled aircraft approximately 20 miles north of grid 42 SMD 15,075,000. Request immediate combat search and rescue support. Viper 21 Magic 77 copies, came the professional reply from the AWACS controller. We're scrambling Pedro flight from Bagram, estimate 25 minutes to your location. 25 minutes might as well have been 25 hours. Maria's aircraft was losing altitude at nearly 500 feet per minute, and she was currently at only 8,000 feet above ground level. By her calculations, she had less than 15 minutes before she would be forced to eject over hostile territory. Tutu, I need you to start clearing a path toward friendly forces, Maria called to Jake. There are enemy positions all along my flight path, and I'm going to be flying low and slow. Roger 2-1, I'm already working targets ahead of your position, but you need to understand that you're flying directly over some of the most hostile territory in Afghanistan. Every Taliban fighter in the region is going to be trying to shoot you down. Maria was acutely aware of her precarious situation. The Kunar province was Taliban's stronghold territory, with enemy fighters positioned throughout the mountainous terrain. Her smoking, low-flying aircraft would be visible from miles away, drawing enemy fire like a magnet. As if to underscore the danger, green tracers suddenly erupted from a ridgeline off her right wing. Taliban fighters had spotted her aircraft and were engaging with everything they had. Maria jinked the aircraft as much as her damaged flight controls would allow, but the A-10 responded sluggishly to her inputs. Taking fire from multiple positions, Maria reported as bullets cracked past her cockpit, continuing south toward friendly lines. Jake rolled his A-10 into an immediate attack run on the enemy positions engaging Maria's aircraft. His 30mm cannon chewed up the ridgeline, temporarily silencing the enemy weapons. But almost immediately, new muzzle flashes appeared from other locations. The whole countryside is lighting up, Jake observed grimly. Every Taliban fighter in the province knows you're up there. Meanwhile, back in the valley where the SEAL team had been extracted, Chief Richardson was monitoring the radio traffic with growing concern. The female pilot who had risked her life to save his team was now fighting for her own survival over hostile territory. Spider, get me a secure channel to the Joint Operations Center, Richardson ordered his communications specialist. I want to know everything they're doing to support that pilot. Within minutes, Richardson was speaking directly to the Operations Center coordinating the rescue effort. This is Neptune 6 Actual, he identified himself using his formal call sign. The pilot of Viper 21 put her life on the line to save my team. I want to know what assets we have available for her rescue. The Operations Center controller's voice was professional but concerned. Neptune 6, we have Pedro flight launching from Bagram with combat search and rescue helicopters, but the pilot's aircraft is currently over heavily contested territory. Even if she ejects successfully, extraction will be extremely difficult. Richardson felt a surge of frustration. After 12 years of combat operations, he had seen too many good people lost to enemy fire. The idea that the pilot who had saved his team might be captured or killed was unacceptable. What about ground forces in the area? Richardson asked. My team is mobile and ready to assist. Negative, Neptune 6. Your team has casualties and needs immediate medical attention. We cannot authorize additional risk to your personnel. Richardson understood the logic, but it didn't make the situation any easier to accept. His wounded teammates needed medical care, but the pilot who had saved them was now in mortal danger herself. Back in the air, Maria continued her desperate flight south toward friendly forces. Her altimeter showed only 4,000 feet above ground level, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The right engine was overheating badly, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that suggested impending mechanical failure. Viper 21, this is Pedro 15, a new voice called over the radio. We're airborne from Bagram with 2 HH-60 Pavehawks. What's your current status? Maria felt a surge of hope at hearing the voice of the combat search and rescue coordinator. The Pavehawk helicopters were specifically designed for recovering downed aircrew in hostile territory, with heavily armed escort aircraft and specialized rescue equipment. Pedro 15, Viper 21, Maria replied. I'm at Angels 4 and descending. Aircraft is severely damaged with multiple system failures. I may be forced to eject in the next 5 minutes. Roger, Viper, we're proceeding to your location at maximum speed. Can you make it to grid 42S MD 18,078,000? There's a small clearing there that might work for extraction. Maria checked her navigation system and calculated the bearing to the suggested extraction point. It was possible, but she would be cutting it extremely close. The aircraft was barely maintaining level flight, and any additional maneuvering might cause a complete loss of control. Pedro, I'll try to make that location. But if I have to punch out before then, I'll transmit my position on guard frequency. Understood. Viper will be monitoring guard, and 2-1. You did outstanding work today. The whole theater knows what you did for those SEALs. As Maria struggled to keep her aircraft flying, she thought about the events of the day. When she had woken up that morning, she had expected a routine patrol mission. Instead, she had found herself in the most intense combat of her career, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for 8 American servicemen. The landscape below was a patchwork of rocky ridges and narrow valleys, perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. She could see smoke rising from several locations where enemy forces were signaling her position to other fighters in the area. It was like flying through a gauntlet, with every mile bringing new threats. Suddenly, the right engine coughed and lost power dramatically. The aircraft pitched down despite Maria's efforts to maintain altitude, and she could hear the distinctive sound of turbine blades rubbing against the engine casing. The surviving engine was failing just like its partner. "Engine failure on the right side," Maria announced over the radio. "I'm going down." The A-10 was now a glider, and not a particularly efficient one. The aircraft's design prioritized durability and firepower over aerodynamic efficiency, which meant that without engine power, it would fall out of the sky relatively quickly. Maria scanned the terrain below, looking for the best place to attempt an emergency landing. The rocky, mountainous landscape offered few good options. Most of the valleys were too narrow and filled with obstacles, while the ridgelines were too steep and uneven for a safe landing. "Viper 2-1, recommend immediate ejection," Jake called urgently. "You're running out of altitude and options." Maria could see a small valley ahead that might offer her best chance for survival. It was relatively flat and appeared to be clear of major obstacles, though it was impossible to tell from her current altitude whether the surface would support an aircraft landing. "I see a possible landing site ahead," Maria announced. "Going to try to put her down in one piece." "Negative 2-1, Jake's voice was sharp with concern. "That valley is unsurveyed. You could hit rocks, trees, or worse. Eject now while you still have altitude." But Maria had already made her decision. Ejecting over hostile territory would mean certain capture, and her aircraft still had some control authority. If she could land the A-10 in one piece, she would have the aircraft's weapons and communications equipment to help survive until rescue arrived. More importantly, the A-10's titanium bathtub around the cockpit would provide protection from small arms fire that a parachute landing could never offer. If Taliban fighters reached her position before friendly forces, she would rather face them from inside an armored aircraft than exposed on the ground. 2-2, I'm committing to the landing," Maria announced as she lined up with the valley floor. "Alert Pedro, flight to my intended landing site." The valley rushed up toward her as Maria flared the aircraft for landing. The A-10's landing gear was designed for rough airfield operations, but this would test its limits. She could only hope that the aircraft's legendary toughness would see her through one more challenge. As the main landing gear touched the rocky valley floor, Maria knew that the most dangerous part of her day was just beginning. The A-10 Thunderbolt II hit the valley floor with bone-jarring impact, bouncing twice before finally settling onto the rocky terrain. Maria Santos fought to maintain control as the aircraft skidded across the uneven ground, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. The screech of metal on rock filled the air as the landing gear absorbed punishment it was never designed to handle. "Touchdown," Maria announced over the radio, her voice tight with controlled tension. "Aircraft is down but intact. I'm still in the cockpit." The A-10 finally came to rest against a large boulder near the center of the small valley. Steam rose from both engines, and hydraulic fluid dripped from multiple locations on the airframe. But the aircraft was in one piece, and more importantly, Maria was alive and uninjured. "Viper 2-1, this is 2-2, Jake's voice crackled over the radio with obvious relief. "Outstanding job getting that bird down in one piece. What's your current status?" Maria quickly scanned her instruments and checked her personal equipment. The aircraft's electrical systems were still functioning on battery power, which meant she still had communications and some defensive systems available. Her personal weapon, a M4 carbine, was secure in its storage bracket, along with 4 magazines of ammunition. 2-2, I'm mobile and combat effective," Maria reported. Aircraft systems are partially functional. I still have comms and some defensive capabilities. Roger 2-1, Pedro flight is 10 minutes out from your position. Can you hold until they arrive? Maria looked around the valley, assessing her tactical situation. The terrain offered some natural defensive positions among the rocks and boulders, but she was essentially trapped until the rescue helicopters could reach her. The smoking wreckage of her aircraft would draw enemy fighters like a beacon. I can hold, Maria replied with more confidence than she felt, but I'm going to need cover from any enemy forces in the area. Jake was already working the problem. Roger 2-1, I'm going to orbit your position and engage any threats. I still have plenty of ammunition and fuel. As Maria began preparing her defensive position, she reflected on the training that had brought her to this moment. The Air Force's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Sears School had taught her how to survive behind enemy lines, but the classroom exercises seemed inadequate compared to the reality of being alone in Taliban-controlled territory. She gathered essential equipment from the aircraft, her survival radio, water, first aid kit, and additional ammunition. The A-10's cockpit was designed to be survivable in exactly this type of situation, with armor plating and emergency equipment specifically positioned for downed pilot scenarios. Maria established her defensive position behind a cluster of large rocks about 50 meters from the aircraft. The position gave her good fields of fire in multiple directions while providing cover from small arms fire. She tested her survival radio and confirmed that she could communicate with both Jake overhead and the incoming rescue helicopters. Pedro 1-5, this is Viper 2-1, Maria called on the emergency frequency. I'm established in a defensive position 50 meters north of my aircraft. The landing zone is suitable for helicopter operations, but expect enemy contact. Roger, Viper 2-1, came the reply from the rescue coordinator. We're 8 minutes out from your location. Maintain your position and be ready for immediate extraction. But even as Maria prepared for rescue, enemy forces were converging on her position. Taliban fighters throughout the region had seen her aircraft go down, and they were moving to capture or kill the downed American pilot. The propaganda value of such a prize would be enormous, and enemy commanders were directing significant resources toward her location. Jake spotted the first enemy movement from his orbiting position overhead. 2-1, I have multiple dismounts approaching your position from the east, approximately 10 fighters moving down the ridgeline toward the valley floor. Maria adjusted her position to cover the eastern approach while maintaining sight lines to other potential threat areas. The M4 carbine felt familiar and reassuring in her hands. She had qualified expert marksman with the weapon every year since joining the Air Force. I see them, Maria reported as she spotted enemy fighters moving between the rocks on the eastern slope. They're trying to use the terrain to get close to my position. Jake rolled his A-10 into an attack run on the approaching enemy force. The 30mm cannon thundered as high-explosive rounds tore into the rocky slope, forcing the Taliban fighters to take cover. Several fighters were caught in the open and eliminated immediately. Good hits on the eastern slope, Jake reported, but I'm seeing more movement from multiple directions. This is going to be a running fight until Pedro arrives. Meanwhile, the rescue force was dealing with its own challenges. The two HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters of Pedro flight were heavily laden with fuel and rescue equipment, making them slower and less maneuverable than their escorts. The rough terrain and hostile environment required them to fly a circuitous route to avoid known enemy positions. Pedro 1-5, this is Hammer 7-7, called the JTAC coordinating the rescue operation. Be advised that enemy forces are converging on the downed pilot's location from multiple directions. You're going to be flying into a hornet's nest. The Pedro flight leader, Captain Sarah Mitchell, had been flying combat search and rescue missions for 3 years. She had recovered dozens of downed aircrew from hostile territory, but each mission carried enormous risks for her crew and aircraft. Hammer 7-7, Pedro 1-5 understood, Mitchell replied. We're committed to the rescue. Do we have any additional air support available? Pedro, we have Viper 2-2 providing close air support at the landing zone. Additional assets are en route, but you're going to be first on scene. Back at the crash site, Maria was engaging enemy fighters who had managed to advance close to her position despite Jake's air support. The Taliban fighters were using classic guerrilla tactics, moving in small groups and using natural cover to avoid the orbiting A-10. Contact front, Maria called as she opened fire on 3 fighters who had appeared from behind a rock formation. Her carefully aimed shots forced them to take cover, but she could see more movement in her peripheral vision. The sound of Jake's aircraft overhead was reassuring, but Maria knew that one A-10 couldn't cover every approach to her position. The enemy was probing her defenses, looking for weak points where they could mass for an assault. 2-1, you've got more movement from the north, Jake reported. Looks like a larger force, maybe 20 fighters. They're staying under cover, but they're definitely moving toward your position. Maria checked her ammunition and calculated how long she could hold against sustained attack. She had approximately 120 rounds for her M4, plus whatever defensive systems remained functional on her aircraft. Against overwhelming numbers, it might not be enough. Pedro, this is Viper 2-1, Maria called on the rescue frequency. Enemy forces are closing on my position. How long until you're on station? Viper Pedro 1-5 is 5 minutes out, came the reply. Maintain your position and be ready for immediate extraction when we arrive. 5 minutes felt like an eternity when facing an approaching enemy force. Maria repositioned herself to cover the most likely avenue of approach while keeping her aircraft in sight. The A-10's weapon systems might still be functional, and she could potentially use the aircraft's cannon against attacking forces if she could reach the cockpit. Suddenly, a burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from the northern ridgeline, bullets cracking past Maria's position and striking the rocks around her defensive position. The Taliban fighters were beginning their assault, using covering fire to allow assault teams to advance. Taking fire from the north, Maria reported as she returned fire toward the muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. Multiple automatic weapons. Jake immediately rolled in to engage the enemy positions with his cannon. The 30 rounds impacted along the ridgeline, but the Taliban fighters had chosen their positions well. The rocky terrain provided excellent cover, and they could continue firing even after taking casualties. Maria could see movement getting closer to her position as enemy fighters used the covering fire to bound forward between rocks and boulders. The classic infantry assault was being executed by fighters who clearly had military training and experience. Pedro, I need immediate extraction, Maria called urgently. Enemy assault in progress. Viper Pedro, flight is 3 minutes out. Can you hold? Maria looked at the advancing enemy forces and calculated her diminishing options. The Taliban fighters were using fire and maneuver tactics to close the distance, and her single rifle couldn't cover all the approaches to her position. But then she remembered the A-10's defensive systems. Even with both engines failed, the aircraft still had electrical power from its emergency batteries. If she could reach the cockpit, she might be able to activate the aircraft's defensive countermeasures and weapons systems. 2-2, I'm going to try to reach my aircraft and activate the defensive systems, Maria announced as she prepared to move. Negative 2-1, Jake responded immediately. That's a 100-meter sprint across open ground. You'll be completely exposed. But Maria had already made her decision. The advancing enemy forces would overrun her position within minutes, and the rescue helicopters were still several minutes away. Her only chance was to reach the aircraft and use its weapon systems to hold off the assault. Cover me, Maria called as she broke from her defensive position and sprinted toward her downed aircraft. The next 60 seconds would determine whether she lived or died in this remote Afghan valley. Maria Santos sprinted across the rocky valley floor toward her downed A-10, bullets cracking through the air around her as Taliban fighters concentrated their fire on her exposed position. Each step felt like an eternity as she zigzagged between boulders, using every piece of natural cover to avoid the incoming rounds. Jake's A-10 thundered overhead as he strafed the enemy positions with his 30 cannon, trying to suppress the fire directed at Maria's desperate run. The high-explosive rounds chewed up the rocky terrain where the Taliban fighters were positioned, temporarily reducing the volume of fire but not eliminating the threat entirely. Come on, Maria, Jake muttered to himself as he watched her sprint toward the aircraft. You can make it. Maria reached the A-10 and vaulted into the cockpit, her hands flying across the instrument panel as she attempted to restart the aircraft's defensive systems. The electrical power was limited with both engines failed, but the emergency batteries still had enough juice to activate some systems. Emergency power to defensive systems, Maria announced over the radio as warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, attempting to activate countermeasures. The A-10's defensive systems included chaff and flare dispensers designed to confuse incoming missiles, but more importantly for Maria's current situation, the aircraft still had some functionality in its targeting systems. If she could get the 30 cannon operational, she would have one of the most powerful weapons on the battlefield. 2-1, be advised that Pedro flight is 2 minutes out, Jake called. but you've got a large enemy force moving into assault positions around the valley. Maria could see the enemy movement from her elevated position in the cockpit. At least 30 Taliban fighters were converging on her location from multiple directions, using the rocky terrain to mask their approach. They had obviously planned this operation carefully, probably hoping to capture her alive for propaganda purposes. Cannon system shows partial power, Maria reported as she worked through the emergency startup procedures. But I'm not sure how many rounds are available. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon held approximately 1,150 rounds of 30mm ammunition, but Maria had already expended significant quantities during the earlier engagement with the surrounded SEAL team. She estimated that perhaps 200 rounds remained, which would be enough for several short bursts. Enemy fire intensified as the Taliban fighters realized that Maria was attempting to reactivate her aircraft's weapons systems. Bullets sparked off the A-10's armored cockpit, but the titanium bathtub surrounding the pilot's position held firm against small arms fire. Taking heavy small arms fire, Maria reported as she continued working to bring the cannon online. But the armor is holding. Suddenly, the targeting system came to life, displaying enemy positions throughout the valley. Maria could see heat signatures moving between the rocks, confirming what she had observed visually. The enemy was closing in from three sides, with the largest concentration approaching from the north. Cannon system is online, Maria announced with grim satisfaction, engaging targets to the north. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with its distinctive buzzsaw sound as Maria triggered a 3-second burst toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. The 30-depleted uranium rounds tore through the rocky terrain with devastating effect, eliminating several fighters and forcing others to seek better cover. But even as Maria engaged the northern assault force, Taliban fighters continued advancing from the east and west. The single cannon could only cover one sector at a time, leaving the other approaches vulnerable to enemy advance. Pedro 1-5, Viper 2-1, Maria called on the rescue frequency. I'm engaging enemy forces with aircraft cannon, but I can't cover all approaches. You're going to be flying into heavy ground fire. Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice came back immediately from the lead Pavehawk helicopter. Understood, Viper. We're 1 minute out from your position. Can you mark the landing zone with smoke? Maria reached for the smoke grenades in her survival kit, but enemy fire was becoming too intense for her to expose herself outside the armored cockpit. Taliban fighters were now within 50 meters of her aircraft, firing from multiple positions around the valley. Negative on smoke, Maria replied. I'm pinned down in the cockpit. The LZ is approximately 100 meters south of my aircraft position. Jake had been monitoring the radio traffic and could see the tactical situation developing below. The rescue helicopters would be extremely vulnerable during the extraction, flying slowly and at low altitude while enemy fighters engaged from concealed positions throughout the valley. Pedro Flight, this is Viper 2-2, Jake called. The LZ is hot with multiple enemy positions. I'll provide close air support during the extraction, but you're going to be taking fire from the moment you enter the valley. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air as Pedro Flight descended into the valley. The two HH-60 Pavehawks flew in formation, with the lead aircraft configured for rescue operations and the trailing bird providing escort and fire support. Pedro 1-5 is on final approach, Captain Mitchell announced. Viper 2-1 prepare for immediate extraction. But as the rescue helicopters descended toward the valley floor, enemy fire erupted from every concealed position around the landing zone. Green tracers reached up toward the aircraft like deadly fingers, and the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire filled the air. Taking fire from multiple positions, Mitchell called as her aircraft shuddered under the impact of enemy rounds. But we're committed to the landing. Maria could see the lead Pavehawk approaching her position, its door gunners returning fire with their M240 machine guns. The pilot was flying an extremely difficult approach, threading between rock formations while taking fire from concealed enemy positions. Pedro, you've got enemy fighters in the rocks east of the LZ, Maria called as she triggered another burst from her cannon toward the eastern positions. The 30 rounds silenced several weapons temporarily, but new muzzle flashes appeared almost immediately. The trailing Pavehawk, Pedro 1-6, positioned itself to provide covering fire while the lead aircraft attempted to land. Its crew chief leaned out the door with an M134 minigun, laying down suppressing fire that forced Taliban fighters to keep their heads down. Jake dove his A-10 toward the most concentrated enemy positions, his cannon thundering as he tried to suppress the ground fire. But the rocky terrain provided excellent cover for the Taliban fighters, and they could continue engaging the helicopters even while under attack from above. "LZ is too hot," Captain Mitchell announced as her aircraft took multiple hits. "We're going to have to abort and try again." But Maria could see that the enemy forces were repositioning to better engage the helicopters during any subsequent rescue attempt. If Pedro flight left now, the Taliban fighters would have time to improve their positions and coordinate their fires for the next attempt. "Negative, Pedro," Maria called. "If you abort now, they'll be ready for you next time. I'm going to clear the LZ." Before anyone could respond, Maria triggered a sustained burst from her cannon, sweeping across the enemy positions around the landing zone. The 30 rounds tore through the rocky terrain, forcing Taliban fighters to seek deeper cover or risk being eliminated. "Now, Pedro, land now while they're suppressed." Captain Mitchell didn't hesitate. She brought her Pavehawk down onto the valley floor in a cloud of dust and debris, her crew chief and door gunner maintaining covering fire while the aircraft settled onto its landing gear. "Viper, we're on the ground," Mitchell called. "Move to the aircraft." Maria grabbed her essential equipment and vaulted from the A-10's cockpit, sprinting toward the waiting helicopter as enemy fire erupted around her. The 60-meter run to the Pavehawk felt like the longest of her life, with bullets cracking past her position and striking the ground around her feet. Jake continued his covering fire from above, his cannon sweeping across enemy positions as Maria ran toward the rescue aircraft. The door gunner on the Pavehawk laid down suppressing fire with his M240, trying to keep enemy heads down during the critical extraction phase. Maria dove through the open door of the helicopter just as Captain Mitchell applied power and lifted off from the valley floor. Enemy tracers filled the air around the aircraft as it climbed away from the landing zone, but the Pavehawk's armor held against the small arms fire. "Package secure," Mitchell announced as her aircraft cleared the valley rim. "Pedro flight is RTB with the survivor." As the rescue helicopters flew toward friendly territory, Maria looked back at her abandoned A-10 sitting in the remote Afghan valley. The aircraft had carried her through the most intense combat of her career and ultimately saved her life even after being shot down. Jake's voice came over the radio with obvious relief. "Outstanding job, 2-1. That was some of the finest flying and fighting I've ever witnessed." 3 hours later, Maria stood in the debriefing room at Bagram Air Base, still wearing her flight suit and carrying the adrenaline of the day's events. The mission commanders and intelligence officers wanted every detail of the engagement, from the initial contact with the surrounded SEAL team to her eventual rescue from the crash site. "Ma'am, preliminary reports indicate that your actions today saved the lives of 8 Navy SEALs," the mission commander informed her. "Chief Richardson's team was completely surrounded and would likely have been overrun without your close air support." Maria nodded, still processing the events of the day. When she had woken up that morning, she had expected a routine patrol mission. Instead, she had found herself in the most intense combat of her military career, making split-second decisions that determined the fate of fellow Americans. Later that evening, Maria received a phone call from Chief Richardson himself. The SEAL team leader had insisted on speaking with the pilot who had risked her life to save his men. "Ma'am, this is Chief Richardson," came the gruff voice over the phone. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did today. Your actions saved the lives of my entire team." "Chief, we're all on the same team," Maria replied. "I was just doing my job." "Ma'am, with all due respect, what you did today went far beyond anyone's job description. Flying into that valley at low level, taking all that damage and still providing cover for our extraction. That was something special." As Maria reflected on the day's events, she thought about the training and experiences that had prepared her for this moment. From her childhood dreams of flying to the rigorous training at the Air Force Academy, from her initial flight training to the advanced tactics she had learned as an A-10 pilot, everything had led to this day. The official after-action report would document the tactical details of the mission. The successful close air support provided to the surrounded SEAL team, the emergency landing of a battle-damaged aircraft in hostile territory, and the successful combat search and rescue operation that brought everyone home alive. But for Maria, the real meaning of the mission was simpler and more personal. When American lives were at stake, she had risked everything to bring her fellow warriors home. It was what any member of the military family would do for each other, regardless of service branch or personal cost. The war in Afghanistan would continue for several more years, with countless missions and operations conducted by American forces. But for 8 Navy SEALs and 1 Air Force pilot, October 15, 2014, would always be remembered as the day when training, courage, and determination overcame overwhelming odds in a remote Afghan valley. Maria Santos would eventually be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions that day, joining the ranks of aviators who had distinguished themselves in combat through extraordinary heroism. But more importantly to her, 8 American warriors had gone home to their families because of the choices made by an A-10 pilot who refused to abandon her mission when the odds were against her. In the years that followed, the story of the female A-10 pilot who saved a surrounded SEAL team would be told and retold throughout the military community, inspiring a new generation of aviators and ground troops who understood that in combat, ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when the lives of their fellow Americans were at stake. The Brotherhood of Arms knew no boundaries of service branch, gender, or rank when American lives hung in the balance. And in a remote valley in Afghanistan, that brotherhood had been tested and proven once again.